Matt, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you making the time today.
Thank you, and likewise, excited to chat.
Yeah. Well, when you sent the email over, there's just so many interesting things. I was excited to have this conversation. It's cool that you're based in Denver. I'm in Rapid City, so we're at least in the same region. And so why don't we kick this off by just maybe talking a little bit about your background and how you got to the place you're at today.
So my background is that of a licensed psychologist. How I got here was a bit unexpected. So while I was in graduate school, learning a little bit more about off the beaten path, like I was actually in this space of non-dual awareness and exploring that from a psychological perspective. While I was going down that rabbit hole, two of my closest friends started a company together. And so watched them grow that into a multi-million-dollar success externally. But as you know, internally, it was a little bit of a different story. And
Sure.
so they shared with me, frustrations with one another, like venting to me about their co-founder. And I was like, look, guys, the problem is not internal. It's not that one of you is right and one of you is wrong. The problem is interpersonal. So we need to sit down and have a group conversation to sort this out. And fast forward, a few different years, and they said, Matt, you not only saved our business, you saved our friendship. And so I was instantly hooked on helping co-founders improve their alignment.
Wow, man, that's a big topic. That's pretty cool, though. It's a cool Genesis story, and it's a good reason to have that North Arrow, right? Like you can really make an impact. So I know you have a book coming out. Is it this summer or is it already out? I don't know exactly when. It's out.
It's out. Yeah, it came out a couple weeks ago, which is great.
Okay, well, congratulations. That's a huge milestone. And so maybe just talk a little bit about it. Is that like a compilation of experiences and kind of tips and tricks to like basically think about these things as you go forward? And it's taking the culmination of your firsthand experience and putting it into some knowledge that people can really leverage.
Absolutely. And I would love to also paint the scene here just a touch, because part of what surprised me is, coming from the psychological background, I knew, of course, about different, couples therapy modalities, systems theories, and all this other kind of stuff. What I didn't realize and why I got hooked on the business partner application is, to me, this seems like the most important relationship in business. At least as I was seeing from my friends, like if you get this right, you're aligned on strategy, execution, and you're really pushing things forward. You set the kind of cultural floor and ceiling for the entire company. And so I was like, okay, wait, this is the most important relationship in business. There's no books going into this in any sort of detail from a psychological perspective. The only book that's remotely relevant is Noam Wasserman's The Founder's Dilemmas, where he has good quantitative analysis, but no qualitative, no really deep case studies or other things. And so I was like, wait a minute. How is it that we have all these tools? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have all these tools that can apply to this relationship, which seems to be the most important relationship in business, and no one is talking about it. And so that was part of what sparked the idea, as I was also meeting with different teams who couldn't afford exec coaching. Like maybe they were pre-seed or bootstrapped very early in the process. And I didn't have a single resource that was comprehensive that I could share with them. And so that's where I was like, oh, wait, I have to write this book because no one else is doing it.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's good. And let's maybe dive in, because I think we see this in spades. So I think the genesis of founders is kind of interesting, right? Because you have an idea, right? You have no idea how far this is going to go. You find somebody who maybe has some alignment on the problem. Hopefully you have somebody that's got some complementary skill sets to you. But you, like you said, this is kind of a marriage in business the evolution of that relationship needs to evolve as the company evolves. And you see this quite a bit where it's like maybe one, either takes on more responsibility or scales better than the other ones. The dynamics that you have at the beginning don't really translate to kind of high growth or kind of, to scaling the business. And so a lot of this is accidental, right? Because you don't have any money. You're you're looking for people. And so we've had some folks that have, they've almost speed dated a lot of founders to find those characteristics, and it still hasn't worked. And so maybe just talk about it from the genesis standpoint, because a lot of this seems super accidental, right? It's two guys or two women or whatever the combination is. They find something they enjoy and they want to go do this. But like the scale and the duration and the types of challenges they're going to have to go face over time, you just don't know it when you start.
100%. And this is, there's the getting together in the first place, finding a good co-founder and placing emphasis there. And then there's kind of what to manage, how to manage things after you've already selected a co-founder. And I think there's a lot of emphasis, retrospectively on looking back and being like, oh, I shouldn't have partnered with this person. And I think it's a really hard challenge. I tend to focus a lot more in the book about and in my work on how to manage any tensions that exist that are inevitable in every single partnership. Because tensions and differences, whether that's conflicting values or life happens, we get sick, someone needs our care or whatever the case may be, we have to be able to create agreements and ideally have a lot of those areas of alignment like you're mentioning. And we need to be able to update and change those as we continue growing and evolving. And if you're scaling and I'm not, then we need to have a conversation about roles and responsibilities to make sure that we're aligning our personal contribution or our professional contributions with what's in the best interest of the company.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So maybe is there some tactical stuff that people should think about as they're finding a co-founder to start with? Like how to, I think it just seems like it's way too organic in some cases. We have a common goal around an idea, but we don't talk about how do we resolve conflict? What do we think the long-term goals of this are? How do we think about ethics, right? There's almost like an interview process that you would do for any other person, but in a lot of cases, I think this happens way more organically without doing those things. And probably what you'd say is that could bite you down the road if you don't address them early.
That's exactly right. And in the book, part of a tool that I recommend here is what I call the partnership term sheet. And so it goes into creating a series of different agreements and making those really explicit. Because to your point, I do see people jumping into partnerships, whether it's because of excitement or opportunity or happenstance. And so there's not a rigorous process to go through and making sure, do we have shared values? Like Noam Wasserman's research talks about, the pursuit of wealth as being one extreme and sort of the need for control over your schedule as the other. And how if there's not alignment there, then the business will underperform both outcomes. And so there's really important structural pieces to have right here. And a lot of those, personal and interpersonal dynamics that are always going to be different. But going back to your point, I think finding a co-founder requires recognizing that you don't really understand someone's true colors until you're under stress. Because part of the theory that I have, and the one similarity that I do see between marriages and co-founding teams, is that it's at root an attachment-based relationship. Meaning, whenever you're spending more time with this person than your spouse, and you're going through a lot of ups and downs that have existential stakes that impact your livelihood, your family's livelihood, etc., that creates a pressured environment where what you want is for your co-founder to be responsive, to be adaptive, to be available, and you want them to see the business needs the same way. You want to feel like you're in lockstep as you're building. And so there's a lot of energy and effort that has to go into maintaining that level of connection and commitment to make sure that you can weather those ups and downs.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And I think maybe even more pointed is the tactical things of getting stuff done is the part that I think a lot of founders focus on without the emotional end of it, right? Where it's the next deal, it's the next release, it's the next raise of funds. And so it's tactically trying to get to these goals, but are you really kind of in touch with what's going on at an emotional level? And we have this in marriages or your relationships too, but I do think it becomes a little bit more transactional. One of the areas that you haven't really mentioned that I think is interesting too is just amount of work, right? Some people are I want to put 60 hours of work in, and this person only wants to put 40, and that's a mismatch out of the gate. And so again, that's another one that we always encourage people to really have some expectations on. Is this going to be a grind for a while, and then we want to make this a lifestyle business, or we want some sort of work-life balance? But I think it's another one that people underestimate, and then they have a mismatch, and then it creates a ton of conflict.
100%. And, that degree of sacrifice is something that I talk about, I think, relatively early in the book, because it's optimal to be explicit, one, because the big problem that I see is unspoken expectations. We're both all in, but not defining and operationalizing what all in means and to what extent we're willing to sacrifice those personal relationships, et cetera, in pursuit of the work. And so, one, I think 100% talking about that, making it explicit is important, and modifying that agreement as needed if and when those values change. Sure. Second point, though, is, you mentioned how a lot of founders mistakenly focus on just the tactical elements. Part of what I've created, and this is a brief digression, is a model that I call the three languages that all teams or all founders speak. And so what I've identified through a lot of different conversations is that there's operational language, psychological language, and archetypal language. And just briefly, operational language is the language of business. This is the default setting, the KPIs, the rapid back and forth communication style focused on the business needs. Psychological language is slower, it's more deliberate, it requires more reflection, more curiosity, it's more emotionally demanding. And it's internally, how am I feeling? Internally, how are you feeling? And then how are we feeling as we're working together? Third language, archetypal language, is the language of the unconscious. This is just the vibe. Like whenever you're part of a high performing team, you feel that sense of flow state. Like we're all just doing, and also even personally, right? If you're like all cooking dinners, a whole bunch of friends, but everyone's doing their job, no one's saying anything, but everyone's just in flow and kind of taking responsibility and ownership and jumping in. That's a state that is like the positive aspect of the co-founder effect. Whenever you get this relationship right, you feel that sense of like buzzword synergy. On the flip side, whenever it's not going well, you get that walking on eggshells or that avoidance or whatever the case may be. And that's also telling you that things are off in the partnership. And so as I look at this, like so to tie this back together, most co-founders, where they go wrong in trying to solve these conflicts or misalignments, is focusing exclusively on operational content and language. So it's like, we're going to argue about product roadmap and go in all these circles because what we're not talking about are unmet needs of recognition or closeness or whatever the case may be. So what's actually needed to solve this problem is not spending more time on the roadmap. It's going down and figuring out what's going on internally and interpersonally between us, because if we can name that and make adjustments, then that will resolve and help us get faster velocity on the product roadmap.
So that's good. And I think that framework really makes a lot of sense. I guess, to me, this is even more complicated in a lot of cases. I was just at a startup this morning and I was working with some folks. And, basically what we were identifying with some of the conflict was a lack of self-awareness and a lack of trust, right? And so I do think a lot of these elements that you're talking about are elements that make sense, but you have to be vulnerable. You have to acknowledge where you have strengths and weaknesses, and then you basically have to trust the individual. And I think, again, this is probably one where the transaction wins out over building that foundation, especially early on, right? We're going to prototype something. We're going to talk to customers. We're going to get that first round of seed money, whatever it happens to be, transactional, and you don't build that foundation. So maybe just talk to me a little bit about, like, how do you build trust that allows you to have those types of levels of conversation going forward? Because I think sometimes that gets missed.
It's a really important point. The way that I talk about trust, just to talk about that for a second, I talk about it as operational versus personal. So operational trust is, I trust your professional competence. I trust that if you say you're going to do the thing, you're going to do the thing. You'll deliver the product. Personal, I trust that if I were to call you late at night or whatever, that you would show up for me. Like if I really needed your help and need you to watch my dog or my kid or whatever, that you would be able to do that. And I would trust your ability to execute that. The reason that I separate that is because a lot of founders I've talked to, and I think being clear about this as a founder is important, about which one you value first and at what stage of company building. I have some teams that I work with where they said, Matt, operational trust is mandatory. If you don't have that, you're not getting in the door. Right?
Exactly. I would agree with you.
And so then the question is, again, some people feel differently. I've talked to other founders who are like, Matt, like, if we don't have personal trust, then I don't want you to be part of this. And so it's different philosophies in company building and kind of culture, that kind of thing. And so I think, one, know that about yourself, about which one feels more important. To your point, though, if there's no company, then what are we doing? Like we have to have something that we're investing in, that we're seeing traction and progress toward in order for this relationship to make sense. So I understand that prioritization. I would just say to build more of the personal trust does require at times a little bit more vulnerability, stating your needs, giving effective feedback, all that we can get into, and doing those repetitions, I think, are what build it over time. And I think you have to have operational trust in place in order to continue working on that personal piece.
Yeah. I think like the ultimate piece of this is, I just don't know if people spend enough time thinking about this up front, right? I think everything is go, go, go. There's 50 number one priorities. And some of this maintenance or investment gets left to later, and then basically it builds up into an explosion, which then is the conflict that, basically, is this going to work going forward, or is it something that we can repair? And by then, it's not usually easy to repair.
That's right. And part of what I talk about in the book is a concept of emotional debt. So that's what I call this, because there's all these little moments, these little, in touchy-feely language, like pinches that can build into a crunch, which is to say that I feel like, oh, you didn't have my back there, or whatever you said just didn't land right, for me, whether I'm hurt or angry or disappointed, it creates an emotional response in me that, to your point, I know that we're busy. I don't want to like take more time out of my day. I don't want to create more friction because we both have to execute to keep this thing moving forward. And the problem though is if you continue compiling a lot of those emotional experiences behind the scenes and not prioritizing the conversation, it creates emotional debt, which can both calcify into resentment, which actually then does threaten the partnership. Or in the environment of building a startup, I talk about it as like a loan with variable interest. There's some moments, if you're in like a really slow pace, whatever, it's like that you can pay that down over time.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you're in growth, you actually can't pay it off in time. So that's whenever you have to come see me. And I would much rather prevent that from happening in the first place.
Exactly. So maybe talk to me a little bit about what you've seen from remote versus in-person founders, because I think this is another one where this gets amplified if you don't address it if you're remote, right? Where it's like it's again, there's a distance. It's harder to read body language. You're not around each other. You're not colliding in the same way where you get to like pick up on a lot of these social cues that maybe are things that you need to invest in versus I'm together with you all the time and I can read some of this, right? You're tired, you sigh, whatever it happens to be. And so is there anything there that you've noticed that that is maybe precautionary, or if you're in a remote situation, you should be doing, maybe being hyper vigilant on some of this?
The piece that I would say you need to be paying more attention to is whenever you're in person, there's more of those informal moments of connection. And so for a lot of teams, especially when things get hard, what you're doing is you're kind of withdrawing. You're making all these withdrawals. And so if there's not enough in the bank, you can overdraw and have a little bit of friction that takes a lot longer to repair and to heal. And so for teams who are remote, without those informal moments of connection, being like, oh, hey, like, look at this thing on my phone, or hey, had a really good investor conversation today, or whatever it is. Those are little emotional bids that help you whenever you turn towards them and acknowledge them, build that connection and trust. And so there's less of those opportunities whenever you're remote. And so you actually need to pay more time and energy effort to schedule and create those opportunities to reconnect. And so part of what I talk about in the book are like these syncs versus dates, because the syncs are more on the side of like operational language syncing, and this can be daily, this can be, a couple times a week, whatever the case may be. And I also carve out special time to do meta communication that is talking about how you're communicating. So working on the relationship, not just in it. Through a date mechanism, which can be informal, like going on a walk together, or if you're Zoom, you're gonna have to figure out other options, but ways to spend time together outside of work that can help rebuild that connective tissue that you both desperately need.
This really resonates with me, and I guess my personal experience on this is when I was working for Concur, we decided to move back to Rapid City in 2004. And so I worked for Concur from 2004 to 2016 remote as an executive. And nobody was doing remote then. My leadership did not want to do that. And so what was interesting was when I went to visit like direct reports or people that I worked with closely, I didn't really classify it as work. I really tried not to do tactical work. I tried to work on the relationship and really schedule that stuff so that when I got back to the office, I had the transactional work that I could go do because I had the relationship and I invested in it. But it was a conscious decision, and it really felt awkward at the beginning because basically what you want them to do is pick up the phone. This was a time when basically Zoom and everything wasn't the tool, and so these people don't even dial you in. And so if you're not being thought about, it was difficult to like get like the headspace to be part of that solution. And so I just had to build a different relationship with them when I was in person, and it was a lot less about the tactical deliverables that we had to go do, and it was about building and investing in that relationship, and that worked really, really well. And what you could do is, because you were there on an incremental basis, you could almost schedule kind of how is this doing and how am I building on the last communication. Whereas if I was in the office, that was a lot harder to keep track of in some cases, and maybe not as deliberate.
Interesting. So let me make sure I'm hearing you right. Like in a way that the distance was a forcing mechanism to prioritize that investment in the relationship. And so in a way it helped you manage it more effectively than if you were just in constant contact.
That's 100% true. And I think I'll even take it a step further. I think I was an average manager when I left concur in person. And I think I got to be a better manager because of the remote and because I was scared crapless about losing my job, essentially, because my leadership was worried about it. And so essentially I went through this whole exercise, and we're going to deviate a little bit from this, but I started to build profiles of people, right? And so about really the psychology. Why are you motivated to do it? How do you best learn? How do you figure out conflict? I basically built this like meta layer about how do I invest in you personally? And why is that different than the next 2 or 3 or 5 people that I'm doing? And so I did that for my direct reports. I did it horizontally, and then I did it for my management. And what I realized was I started to have a better understanding of how do I take my data and my agenda and basically work with them to get what I needed done. Or if it's my direct reports, how do I maximize the potential of this individual? But a lot of it started with, I need to understand them at a pretty visceral level. I need to have trust. I need to have vulnerability, self-awareness. And then from there, I can grow them. But like, I think that if I was in the office, it wasn't a forcing function in the same way because you're not like as intentional about it. And so being remote, it scared me a little bit. And then I started to create this, and I became a much better manager going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like best case scenario for you, and I guess part of what I'm hearing is how much more strategic you were about maximizing these relationships and the impact of the communication. It definitely sounds like kind of more advanced in terms of like the management level. Like there's a lot of first time managers out there that I kind of work with through that transition.
Yeah, and I think there are some basic ones, though, even just like, how do you best learn, right? Like I had an employee that was on my team, and he was terrible. Like we had a culture of go to the dry board and brainstorm and best ideas win. And he was terrible at coming up with it on his feet. And so he got shuffled around, ended up on my team. And all I did was, here's the topic for tomorrow's meeting. I just need you to think about it. And he came with a whole bunch of ideas, and he was like one of the best guys at doing that, but he wasn't great at doing it. And so how do you resolve conflict? How do you best learn? There are some elements here that like I think first-time managers can start to put people in the best opportunity to be successful, but you can't just treat them like you want to be treated, right? You have to like meet them where they're at and then figure out how to maximize that talent.
Yeah, I think that's the job of an effective manager for sure.
Yeah.
And The one story that was coming to mind as you were talking about this was I was working with a co-founding team relatively recently where they were working remote, one person, like multiple time zones apart, that kind of thing. And there was a lot of friction in the relationship and misalignment. And as we started our sessions, one intervention that we had was actually scheduling time for once they were in person, which they were doing like once a quarter-ish, something like that, of being really protective in prioritizing that, like, for them, it was a shared meal, like a lengthy shared meal together, at least once during that week immersion. And that was one kind of forcing function that then really helped them unlock more of those moments of personal connection and lubricate some of those more friction-oriented interactions that they were having professionally.
One of the things that I always found the best was I found like a chef that basically would coordinate you building the meal. So you take your team, and it kind of goes back to the flow state you were talking about where you got friends, but like you're taking them out of the environment, but you're a team because you have to build this meal, right? From everything from the salad to the main meal to the dessert, whatever it happens to be. And basically everybody's got to play their role, and there's conflict, there's all sorts of things. But it was just one of those things that like everybody always talked about afterwards, where it was like we all shared this wonderful meal that we all worked hard to do, but we all had a part on it. And it kind of normalized everybody's roles a little bit, and you got to see different perspectives. And so I do think whether it's a shared meal or it's an activity like this, I think being intentional about that stuff and figuring out how to really fill that need is important.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. And it's one of those things that I think, to your point, there's so many other pressing concerns. And so the dilemma that I think every founder and also every person in relationship is faced with is, can I, for this moment, put all of the to-do list aside and show up for this person in this moment? And it's not something that is easy. Like I think we all also have our own limits, our own anxieties and concerns and stress levels. And if we're able to manage that effectively, my hope is that leads to more intentional moments of connection like you're talking about.
Yeah. So let's pivot to, we've talked a lot about the founder components of it. One of the elements that I think is interesting is how does that lead to culture, right? And so I think what generally happens from my perspective is you have two guys that basically have a way of working. And as long as they're involved in the hiring, like pretty explicitly, they tend to hire people that are like them. They don't document culture. They don't document values because you're moving fast. And then all of a sudden you get to a point where now I've got managers that are hiring and they're doing their own thing. And yes, I hired them, so they should have the same thing, but like it doesn't amplify. And so like I do think that this is, I was telling you before, like I was at a company called Concur where we scaled a ton. And I do think that the cultural aspect of this was like a huge important element. And I think in 2000, we were relatively small, but we stopped and we said, what are our core values? How do we hire? What's good behavior? What's bad behavior? We documented all that stuff. And then we were pretty good at stamping out bad behavior. And then we were good at like promoting good behavior. And I think that was like really part of what started to like make some coalesce around kind of this shared goal. Like it wasn't, somebody's new and they're struggling. Your job is to help them, right? Even if it's like contradictory in sales because maybe you don't get to your number, we're all in this together. And so maybe talk to me about like how do founders go from individuals to basically defining a culture and growing it?
The first thing I'll share is that I'm kind of allergic to the bullshit slogans that people slap on walls. Like,
Yep.
It drives me nuts, right? Like this whole, for example, like we're going to create values that we think sound good or sound resonant or whatever, as opposed to figuring out what's actually happening in the culture. And so to your point, my hope is actually that teams start focusing on this element earlier. And so like one thing that's in the book are what I call invitations to a healthy culture of communication, which it takes like very much like instead of a top-down approach of let's do this value sorting thing and like talk about it or whatever, it goes to a far more bottom-up place of basing the culture on some of those different dynamics that are already happening in the co-founding team and kind of and then expanding beyond that to the leadership team at a relatively early stage so that we can start to codify that into our hiring, into how we're looking and selecting people, et cetera. And so that's something that feels important. But the other thing that I think is one of the more underestimated aspects here is like, if you get that relationship right, then you are always transmitting some of those cultural values. And so to your point, there's also like that selection bias in how we hire early stage people. But the way that it feels all connected to me is recognizing that those early stage employees are the cultural stewards that are going to be initiating and transmitting that culture as you continue growing. And so that's where I think investing in some of those more touchy-feely aspects early on can actually pay off long-term, because then you're actually creating a little bit of a tighter network where there's a little bit more consolidation around those lived values, not just aspirational values.
And I think that's the key that I was just going to get back to is like, I think too many times they put aspirational, not what we live. And I think putting crap up on the walls is fine if that's really what you value and then you reward, right? I think that's the thing, So, we had a relentless commitment to win. With there's some values around the customer. We had some really good things, but like basically from the leadership at the executive level down, it was basically reinforced. We told stories that reinforced it, and then when there was bad behavior, basically you got like the behind the door kick in the butt to start with. And then it was a public flaming, and then you're out. Like, right? It was like 3 strikes and you're out. And so, like I thought it was good, but like you said, it was lived values that we reinforced. And to be honest, I think we had maybe 5 or 6 to start with, and then we pared them down because we realized maybe 2 of them we weren't living the way we wanted. So we stripped them and said, look, maybe that's more aspirational. We can't put that on there because we're not living that. Let's go back to the 4 that we actually do and reinforce. And I thought it was good. I mean, it was like just an honest thing. And so maybe talk to me about like, how do they find those things, right? Like, I think, it's easy to talk about aspirational. It's very difficult to say, what do I actually do every day and reinforce that?
Well, an example that comes to mind is that I recently helped a team during an offsite, and it was just like a couple different, few-hour conversations where part of what I led them through was a series of exercises and conversations to figure that out, of like, what are the unspoken emotional dynamics that are shaping our workplace? And that can start individually, like who's the contrarian for the team, who's like the emotional glue that's always really, curious and wanting to connect with other people. And so it can start on roles. It can also just jump right into being more explicit about how we handle conflict, how we handle high expectations and pressure, and trying to be honest and direct. So that's where we're also doing a couple things simultaneously. We're deepening the amount of vulnerability and connection. So we're kind of working on that personal trust element. and we're naming what's already happening, both that's working well and that's not working well, and then trying to codify it from there. And so that's the kind of process that I recommend, is more of an introspective and collective mind sharing about what's actually happening on the ground.
So I think this is hard though. I think, you're trying to build something that's enduring, that's not going to be here a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Like it's got to be for the duration of your company. That's one. I think the other part is, I think a lot of the people you have early on are maybe very tactical. They're kind of execution oriented people, right? Like maybe you're founders or visionaries, but I think like in general, you're hiring people to actually get crap done. And so I found even in our process that like maybe the first start of what we had was too tactical, too transactional, but then you can go to aspirational, right? And so there's something in between, and I think finding that basically then scales with your business is kind of a difficult process to go through. And so I don't know if that resonates with you, or if you have any constructive feedback on like how to find that balance.
As you said that, it brought up a recent interaction that I had with a CEO who's scaling like in rapid growth right now, and part of because I was talking to him about some of the cultural values, and I was really curious to see some of that as I'm doing more work with some of the teams. And one thing that he mentioned was, Matt, early on in the process, I would, I started with a few different core values that felt really resonant, in particular, like with the type of work that we do that has a certain mission to it. And I would always add one or two that I felt like were stretch goals, that were a little bit of like where I think our deficits are that we really need to improve for us to get to the next milestone. And so that's almost part of how I'm thinking about what you just said of being honest and truthful, and trying to convey what's actually happening on the ground, so that there is that congruence and alignment. And also, is there something that you need to grow into in order to continue moving and progressing as a company, and perhaps trying to make that explicit as an expectation, as a value, and reinforcing it, to your point.
Yeah, I think that is good. I mean, we had one like confronting the brutal facts, which is kind of, we're going to be very honest, and we're going to deal with whatever problems we have. And I think that was like a theme that worked really well for us all the way through this. Maybe talk to me about the mechanics of reward and discipline around it, because I think you can put these out there, but I think if the leadership team doesn't have the discipline to promote good behavior and basically tamp out bad behavior, I think that and that's part of your job as a leader. Like, I don't care if you're a founder, if you're a manager, if you're a lead, you basically have to do that. And I think institutionalizing that early is important.
Yeah, I mean, this is where like the rubber meets the road. It's one thing to have a nice conversation about it. Reinforcing is a lot harder. And, I'll reiterate this one point before going there, which is, I think modeling it's absolutely necessary. Because again, if you're saying one thing and doing another, it's already dead in the water. Yeah. So let's say that you're living the value. Then I think part of it is absolutely being explicit in reinforcing it, and I mean that both. You can do that through performance reviews and like making sure that there's alignment there, and you're giving tactical feedback. But I think those informal moments are arguably even more important, where you're reinforcing oh yeah, like this is a really good example. Let me highlight this this example where this colleague or direct report was really living the value and showing that. And to your other point, when that's not the case, giving that feedback directly, and again, I think they're like best practices for how to deliver effective feedback. So I'd still recommend that. Like name calling obviously is perhaps not going to be useful here, but being really explicit with that feedback and direct rather than holding it in, it is part of the job description.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, and I think like I was saying before, I think we had a closed door situation where you could basically explain it and you could get context. And then there was some public shaming. Like the next strike was basically, we're going to call you out in a setting that's not right. And then basically if it happens again, for the most part, you were gone, right? Like, and so we had kind of these stages. I don't know if those are healthy, but like we did try to take care of it in a closed door environment where it was safe. And then basically if you're going to continue to do it, we need to tell people that behavior is not okay. Because if they're doing it publicly, it's probably not the last time they've done it. It's happening quite a bit. Go ahead.
You mind if I ask a quick question about? I was curious with the public piece of it. Is that only for public facing behavior, like things that people are doing in front of others, or would you kind of like air the dirty laundry, so to speak, of like, oh, this is happening behind closed doors, and we're just trying to show this is not how we do things here?
No, like I'll give you an example. Like I think somebody like I know an example that this constantly was. There was a guy that was working on one of the teams, and there was a chain of events that we had to go do to solve a customer problem. And every time it got to his, he was like, "Dude, I'm out. I'm not. I got other priorities that I need to go do." And so you basically come and say, "Hey, look, you're one of 5 people that need to deliver this solution to them. They told you in plenty of time that like it was coming, and basically you didn't get it done, and you deprioritized it to get other things done that you thought were more important. We can't keep doing that, right?" And so the next one was we let a customer down. This is the public facing one. We let a customer down because we didn't get all of our components down. It didn't necessarily, in most cases, call them out, but it basically explained that we did not deliver to our customer the way we expected to. We need all of us in this chain to actually deliver on what that is. And so I do think some of it got sharper, if it was individual, but I think what you're trying to do is say collectively, we're all in this together. We all had to do our 5 things to get this to a customer. And then in this case, it actually happened a couple more times. And it was more of a selfish behavior. I did not want to do this because I thought there were more important things that benefited my career more than what you wanted me to go do. And then at that point, we were just like, look, man, you're probably not the right fit for the company. And we parted, amicably, but it was reinforcing the culture that's saying, if we commit to this to the customer, we all have to do our part.
I really appreciate you elaborating on the example, because to me, I mean, that's such a good example of quality leadership, and something that, at least part of what I see, and I work with a lot of early stage founders broadly, and then certainly some that are a bit past that. And this is one major difference I see between first-time managers and people who have, this is their third or fourth, venture, because it seems like there's a certain degree of self-knowledge and self-belief that you have to have in yourself in order to give that kind of feedback and to reinforce those values. It requires knowing, like, okay, I'm living this. I understand that there could be implications here, and I'm okay with those implications, because reinforcing the cultural values is actually going to be more helpful for the team as a whole than allowing this behavior to continue.
Right. It is. And we used to basically, like, all managers were responsible for giving out awards, on a pretty regular basis to people that exhibited these things. So we always had to find events that basically said, let's find examples and tell stories of behavior that's good, right? And so, and reinforce that. And so, basically, if you're coming into the company, you see that that's what's been modeled, and that's what's valued, and that's what's getting anything from a Starbucks gift card to the promotion to whatever it happens to be, but it's reinforcing it. And I thought our leadership from the exec staff down just did a really good job of saying that is all of our responsibilities. I don't care where you are. I'll give you one more example that I thought was pretty interesting. We had an NPS rating, a net promoter score, that was a -11 at one point in time. -11, not good. We're losing customers, and we took a percentage of our bonuses and said every single person in the company is now responsible for this. And lots of people flipped out, right? Like, I'm not customer facing. I'm in dev. That doesn't make any sense. I'm in finance. I work in HR. That's not fair. And basically what we said was, no, either we all succeed or none of us succeed. And what was interesting was you find the example where a customer's calling finance and they're asking about their bill because there's a question on it. And you're like, now's your opportunity, right? HR is trying to find people to put them in the position that can reinforce the way that we want to care about the customer. Everybody has a role, but it took a while for us to go to it. So we ended up at 67 or 70, something like that over time. But like it was part of our core values. And then it was basically saying, we're all in this together, and I don't care what your role is, you have a role to play in doing that, and you need to reinforce that in your teams. And it worked. But like there was some painful 6-7 months where people like, I'm not bought in. This isn't fair.
It's a really powerful description of living and reinforcing some of these cultural values. And one thread that was common in both the examples you shared is how much emphasis was placed on the collective, on the we, as opposed to the I.
Yeah. Well, I think that was a big part of it. And so your job was to help that individual, even at maybe the expense of your bonus, right? Like that's basically the culture you want. And so it created, and we ended up with 7,000-8,000 people before we were acquired by SAP. And so keeping that from, the small group all the way through, it was a great experience for me personally. And it was like, I was never qualified for any of the jobs I did, Matt. Like I constantly was being asked to go do something different, but a lot of it was just leadership, right? A lot of it is, basically, how do you want to lead this team? You knew what worked in the organization, what they valued. Now the question is, can you execute with a new team and a new opportunity? And it was great. It was, for 20 years, I got all sorts of interesting opportunities.
That's awesome.
Yeah. All right. Well, so where do you want to go next? Like, is there, I know you were talking about like maybe some of the tactical things. We see a lot of in-person, like burnout, right? Is definitely one where I think, small teams are asked to do a lot, and they get burned out. There's imposter syndrome, that basically they come to us and they're like, yeah, like I know this domain expertise, but like I'm not really an entrepreneur and I'm trying to figure this out. Like, how do you deal with some of this stuff? Because like I think almost every one of these teams has some level of components of this that they find difficult when they first start.
100%. And I'll start with the co-founding team just because that's where I place the most emphasis, and then we can kind of trickle down from there. So with burnout and imposter syndrome, that shows up all the time. And this is part of why I think the co-founder relationship is the most important relationship in business. Because as I mentioned, when it goes well, I think that it buffers you from entrepreneurial stress. Some of those ups and downs, I think that the amplitude actually decreases a bit whenever you have someone that you can rely on, because you can't be honest with your employees, your investors, your spouse can only get so much. And also there's this spillover effect where the work ends up following you home. That's not helpful for your partnership either. And so I think having someone that you can rely on consistently, who understands the same perspective, who can have your back, I think that's an insulative factor. And the flip side, though, is that whenever this relationship doesn't go well, it deteriorates and makes everything else harder. That's the existential threat piece of it, where instead of being up at night thinking about your product, you're up thinking about the conversation you had earlier that day with your co-founder. And so that's a net negative for your personal well-being and your professional performance and for the company as a whole. And so that's why I really want to work with co-founding teams, because I think if we get it right, it will have a multiplier effect kind of across the board and mitigate burnout, et cetera. Now, we can't eliminate some of those things fully. And I think it's important to distinguish, because I think burnout is one of those phrases or words that is really loaded right now with a lot of different definitions. As I talk to founders about burnout, I differentiate it between like that and exhaustion or fatigue, because sometimes they're being used interchangeably, and I view them psychologically as quite different. Exhaustion and fatigue is more of, physically, mentally, emotionally being drained and feeling like, okay, man, I'm gonna have to like double down on the coffee today or whatever the case may be to push through. And yet you still might be connected to the meaning and purpose of what you're doing. It still may feel important and valuable to you. Burnout is whenever some of those deeper motivators are dwindling. So burnout is, I feel a lack of purpose. I feel a lack of meaning. This doesn't feel like it. Like, why am I even doing this? And so to me, it's exhaustion with something a little bit deeper. And sometimes that requires a different solution than rest alone.
So dig deeper on that. Like, I totally agree with you. You basically lose sense of purpose on this, right? Like, I'm kind of giving up, right? Like, I'm going through the motions. I'm tired. I'm exhausted, but I really don't have the passion for this nearly as much as I used to. I think that's really what you're articulating. And so help me unpack, like, what do you do there? Because you see it in spades, right? Like, it's like, I've just spent a year working on this thing, and I just don't know if I've got the energy and the passion to continue to get up and do it.
This is where, this is a painful and challenging conversation and like moment in time whenever you hit this point. And it's deeply human. It's something that, if we were a robot, we'd just push right on through and whatever, but we're not. And so this is where I think starting to have those challenging reflections of what's in the best interest of the company. Should it be with myself as the leader? Or could it be better served by someone else who has those bright eyes and bushy tail and the energy to jump and invest into this? I think it becomes a worthwhile question. In the meantime, I would say, and maybe actually I just stay there for a second. Most founders, I think, whenever they reach that point, try to shy away from it, and at absolute best, will take like a week off. And a week will recharge you a little bit, help repair some of the exhaustion, maybe take take the intensity down a bit. But that root cause that we're talking about, that lack of purpose, that doesn't get fixed overnight. And so that's something where ideally, whether it's therapy, journaling, meditation, like whatever your kind of healing method of choices, I think doing more of that is important. Like doing work on this thing to make sure it is in alignment. Because if it's not fully in alignment with your well-being, what you're drawn to, what you're curious about, then I think having more of that structural conversation is an important one.
I'd maybe even make a finer point on this is, I think all entrepreneurs have things that they gravitate towards and they love and they give them energy. And then there's things that they have to do that take energy. And I think what I see in some cases is that ratio out of balance. And so do you need to go back and create more time to do the things that give you energy, that gave you passion to start with, and then look to either delegate or, shed some responsibilities in the areas that drain you. And so that takes some time, right, to like see that. But I do think that is part of what leads to this is you end up doing just a lot of things you don't want to do. And it takes away from the thing you enjoy doing that gives you that energy. It just becomes smaller and smaller. And I don't know if that resonates with you and that's what you've seen, but at least that's been some of my experience when we get to the kind of the burnout component of it.
I really appreciate that point and completely agree that it kind of gets back to the zone of genius type of work, right? Of like, how can I get back to that thing that gives me energy that I feel like I'm really good at that no one else can do? Outsourcing is, or delegating or however it needs to be structured so that you can get back to that place. 100% agree. And so there are phases in I think every business that's growing that require that grind and that kind of push through the grit of the challenging work that you don't want to do. And ideally that's an inflection point that then you can unlock that next phase where you're getting back to some of those things. And so I think there's an element there that's normal. I guess the piece that to me would be more concerning is if it's like, if it's not just work task related, if it goes beyond that to like this entire venture, like why? And then you get into like the sunk cost, and that's kind of a deeper spiral.
Yeah. And I mean, I would even say just my personal experience, I think when I was working in Concur, I had this kind of mentality of just like book every time and be as massively efficient as I possibly can. And, I got a lot of crap done, but I didn't really think about the business nearly as much. And I think, today I create space to read, learn, and that fills the tank. And I'm a way more creative, empathetic, strategic partner in my businesses that I do because I've created space. And I just didn't, I thought like the value of what people saw as my output was all of this work. But I think as I've gotten older, I've realized I just need some space to think, and I need to read, and I need to go on some rabbit trails all around this area. But I basically will be much better at guiding the company if I can actually do that and create that space. But like that takes some self-reflection, that takes some discipline, because there's lots of people coming to you and saying, I need this and I need that and I need that. And you're like, well, maybe it's not going to happen, or I'm not going to get to it as quickly as you want me to.
I wonder if that also takes self-trust.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I agree with you. And I think it goes back to your partnership with your co-founder, right? I may not be giving you the same traditional work output, but is the value that I'm providing for you still a contribution that moves the organization forward that you feel is equal, even though the intrinsic amount of time and effort you put into it may be different?
I think that's right. And it's a really challenging thing. The reason I mentioned the trust is a lot of early stage people that I see building here think it is all about output and also sometimes just hours in the day. And so they're working these insane amounts of hours. And yet I'll see someone who's more seasoned where this is their fourth venture and they have a lot more balance. And I'm not saying compared to the average 9 to 5 that they have balance, but within the context of like a high pressure startup, they have relatively more balance and more inputs and more space than some of the younger folks. And so I do think there's this knowledge that has to exist, this self-trust of, hey, even for myself, I'm not going to get to that as fast as I want today. Right. I will, reallocate time and do some other things and have some uninterrupted deep focus time or whatever the case may be. But I'm not going to get to all those things today. And can I tolerate that pressure that I feel and manage that so that I can create the space for the input that I need to then execute more effectively?
Yeah. Easier said than done. And I think that comes with, kind of maybe some churn and then, figuring out. Maybe the last thing I'd say about this that maybe is somewhere in between is realizing that there is kind of a gas gauge to this, or like a RPM, right? Like you can run in the red for a while, but you got to come back out of it. And so I think, if you're trying to ship a product and you got a big push, that's fine, but then you got to pull the gas back a little bit. And so even that concept, I think you can't just run in the red line. There was an entrepreneur that I worked with, and this was her golden ticket. She's going to make a bunch of money. This is going to be life-changing money for her. But like, she lived in the red line, and she could do it. She's been doing it for 5 or 6 years. But like, she just burned through people because she thought that they should have that same propensity to do that. And just could not really wrap her head around why, like, somebody who doesn't have the same incentives, doesn't have the same money or the same equity in the company, just never did it. And so, like, for a while, she just churned and started to realize and come to the rationale, like, my expectations for myself are different than my employees. And it just takes some time. And unfortunately, there was some churn and some casualties along the way in that.
Yeah, that's another really important thing to learn, right? That the expectations you have for ownership, responsibility, buy-in, work hours, it all has to be very different from a founder level to an employee.
Yeah, it is. Well, Matt, maybe this is a good place to leave it. I really appreciate this conversation. It's been super interesting. You've got the Cofounder Effect book out now, so if people are interested, go find it, Amazon, wherever. But if they're interested in working with you or learning more about kind of what you're doing, what's the best way to do that?
Of course, you can go to cofounderclarity.com. And I have a free excerpt there of the book if you want to give that a trial first. Just try it before you buy it, and a couple other tools for founders that you can use right away.
Okay, well, good. Well, I appreciate you sharing kind of your knowledge and your experience, and then kind of in the framework of this. I don't think this is a topic that gets enough discussion. We talk a lot about the tactics and all the other pieces that you got to do, but the interpersonal relationships, and it creates a lot of stress in these environments. And I think that co-founder relationship is so important to get right early on, and I don't think we make enough time or investment to do that, really.
Yeah, and thanks so much for covering it. I completely agree with you.
Well, good. Well, thanks again, Matt. I appreciate it.
Likewise.
Thanks for listening to Startup Stories from the Treehouse. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, follow, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found our conversation helpful, leave a review. It really helps other founders discover our show. For more insight and episode summaries, don't forget to subscribe to the Wildfire Labs Substack. We appreciate your support and can't wait to share more stories with you next time.